So a few years later, I became an elder at the church, was asked to be chairman of our long-range planning task force to study what to do about our growth. We voted to relocate. They asked me to come on staff to manage that project. I said no. I'm not sure how many times I said no. But finally, I said yes for 2 years. During those 2 years, I also became director of the staff. Church of about 600 or 800, 600 maybe at the time, 20 some staff. And so I came for 1 or 2 years. We moved in after finally relocating 7 years later. And I stayed for another 10 years. So I was on staff for 17 years. So God clearly tricked me. Clearly. He didn't let me see that because I would have run the other way very fast. And so now, fast forward, what I do is I have a little ministry called Transform, where I consult with churches, coach pastors, help churches start discipleship, do strategic planning, other things like that. I'm very blessed to be doing it, but He's given me this big heart for the church. You know, I was saved a little later in life. I was like 32 years old. And for some reason, I just loved the church and wanted her to be a more and more beautiful bride ever since then. And this is a way that I can do that. We have 2 children. Jonathan's 26. He's getting married in October. I'm still an elder at Perimeter Church, by the way, a ruling elder. And he's marrying the daughter of another ruling elder at Perimeter Church. And my daughter Julia turns 21 next Wednesday. And is a rising junior at Valdosta State University. So both great kids. Thank God they both love the Lord. And so that's my family. But during this time that I was on staff at Perimeter, in fact, during the relocation time when we were working on that project, besides the relocation, but more than the relocation, even the most important thing that happened at that church is that we started doing what I'll call reproductive, replicative, life-on-life missional discipleship. And the way we started doing that is, the reason we started doing that is that we were growing wildly. That's why we needed to relocate. That's why we were on 10 acres. We owned 10 acres right next to us to expand to. But we decided to sell all that and move to 100 acres so that we have room to grow into the future. So I see you've got that and a little bit more here. So we're looking forward to what that looks like as you grow. We wanted to create opportunity for God to just do whatever He would do. But that growth feels like success to the church. We were even written up in a couple of books, referenced in a couple of books. Had a whole chapter in one book because of some of the things we were doing. But we weren't we were successful in the way people usually measure churches. Numbers, money, growth. Small groups. We had world-class small groups ministry. But we brought a consultant in to assess the spiritual maturity level of our people. And in his report back to us, he said, I cannot detect any difference in the spiritual maturity between people in your small groups, people that have been in your small groups in the past, and people that have never been in your small groups. So most churches back then were saying, that's the way to maturity is small groups. We had small groups. We had a lot of them, and they were well organized. They were well coached by one of our pastors that had a passion for small groups. He cared for the leaders. And yet, this consultant said, you think this is where you're maturing people spiritually? You are not. It ain't happening there. So he said, boy, we have a problem. Houston, we have a problem. And so at a staff retreat up in Helen, Georgia, in the mountains of North Georgia, Randy Pope charged the ministry staff with that issue and said, we need to figure out what is important as a church. And we decided what's important is making mature believers for the lost world. That was our vision statement we came up with at the time. And we said, but what's a mature believer? What's that target? And so we had to define mature believer. So we came up with a written definition of mature believer. And we said, are we making these kinds of people? And we wrote on the board all the people in our church we could think of that we saw were either sort of, that person really described Jesus, of course, because that's our model for mature believer. So nobody met everything on there, but we had a few people that met some of the stuff and were on the journey. And then we looked at that list and said, what's common among those people? And I cannot tell you how long we sat there staring at an easel with those names, just staring at it. And finally, Randy, the pastor, said, I don't know, but I think I know what's common among 2/3 of the men on that list. We said, what? He said, I discipled them. We said, are you convinced there's a link between the fact you discipled them and they're on this list? He said, I'm absolutely convinced. We said, how do you know? He said, because I led them to Christ first, then I discipled them. So they wouldn't be on there if I hadn't been involved in their life in that way. So we said, Randy, can we do what you've been doing? He goes, I don't know. So we said, tell us what you've been doing. So he described it. And he had done the very same thing with me. So it sounded a little familiar. After he described it, we said, can we do that? He goes, yes, if I help you. I think you can. There's no reason you can't. So that's when we decided to develop discipleship that was more transferable, that got out of Randy Pope's basement and the one group of men that he led every year through discipleship. And that's when we started several groups. I was privileged to be leader of one of those groups, and that was my introduction. I had tried it. I had tried a couple different ways before, and they kind of lasted a year, and we said goodbye, and nothing happened. But this was different. So this is like 20 years ago. And fast forward to today, Perimeter has over 100 men's discipleship groups, over 100 women's discipleship groups. 85% of the youth are in a discipleship group with an adult or a more mature youth. And about 60% of the children starting in first grade are in discipleship groups, which look very different, of course, on Sunday morning. So Perimeter is all about discipleship today. And 5 years ago, when I left staff and started doing what I'm doing with churches, I knew that one of the things I wanted to do is help churches do that. And so a good chunk of what I do is help churches get discipleship. To start from, how in the world would I even do this? I'm talking to the pastor asking this question, to actually that happening in their church and becoming a core of their church. And so of all the things I do at churches, I don't get any greater joy than I do doing that. And hearing the stories of the leaders and their transformation and the transformation of the people in the groups, and pastors out of ministry where they have not been getting joy out of ministry and saying things like, why haven't I been doing this? I can never not do this again. So that's why I'm here, because it impacted me, it changed my life, it's impacted my wife, it's impacted my son, it's impacted my daughter. And now she's discipling some young women at the university, through Navigators ministry, by the way. And every time I help a church do strategic planning, which I've done a lot of, very strangely, they come out with one of the main things they need to do is life and life missional discipleship. I don't know why that is, but that always seems to come out of that. And so then we can help them get going. So any questions for me before we go further? Just about my testimony, who I am. God continues to work in my life. In the last 2 years, He has changed me tremendously.